So my guest tonight is Dr. John Moore, who's been a guest with us before. He's a professor of microbiology and immunology at Weill Cornell Medicine, and he's known for his research on HIV/AIDS. He previously worked at the Aaron Diamond AIDS Research Center. You will hear he's British, and he has his BA, MA, MS in philosophy, and PhD degrees from Cambridge University, UK. So, anyways, thank you, Dr. Moore. We're going to discuss the origins, the COVID-19 origins saga. Was there a lab leak? Now, you wrote an article for SWINY, I believe.
Yeah.
Yes, where you said called it COVID-19 origins saga. Do we learn anything new? And you kind of said right away, to answer the question I posed in the title, no, we did not. No new facts emerged that would help us understand the key events that occurred in Wuhan, China in the closing months of 2019. What we did see was a flood of news stories and opinion pieces of highly variable quality. So can you tell me how this interest in the labs started again? I mean, and, give some with the Department of Energy report and the Congress investigation.
Well, I wrote for SWINY.com because I've done a few articles on other COVID-related topics over the past couple of years, and it's a website that likes to put out a centrist position to navigate the extremes on either side. I don't have a dog in this fight. I don't work on the subject. I don't have any personal specific insights. I am a virologist and vaccine researcher by training, and I have obviously followed the pandemic and written a number of editorials on multiple subjects. So I'm aware of what's going on around me, but I think there are probably people maybe on this call who know more of the minutiae of the dueling positions on the origins of the pandemic. So I could easily skate over important sub-themes that may just come up in Q&A. And I said in this editorial that we learned nothing new last week, and I think that is true. What happened was that, and I'm getting this from science writers and journalists that I interact with, there was a leak to the Wall Street Journal on, I think, the Sunday of last week, about 10 days ago, reporting without any significant details that the DOE had changed its assessment of the origins of the pandemic from a neutral position to one that was with low confidence in favor of lab leak. And that triggered a story in the Wall Street Journal, and then everyone else piled in. None of these stories has been able to reveal what the new information was that triggered the change of assessment by the DOE. And I've been told by one high quality reporter that the change in assessment was made in the later months of last year. It was not something new per se, but the DOE report was in the hands of politicians, Congress people, and one of them is thought to have leaked it to the Wall Street Journal a few days before congressional hearings on the origin. And I think it's reasonable to assume that the goal was to gin up coverage and interest in this congressional, what you can call it any one of a number of things. Some people have just simply referred to it as a dog and pony show. Others think it's a serious discussion of what might have happened, but nothing new per se has emerged. So we are now where we were for the best part of 3 years now, that there are two competing theories, both centered on the pretty established fact that the COVID pandemic started in Wuhan, China in the last couple of months of 2019. That is not a controversial statement. The Chinese government has, a couple of years ago, started throwing around suggestions that it was brought into China, the virus was brought into China by an American military sports team or on imported American fish. I mean, we can ignore all of that and settle that it emerged in Wuhan, China in the last couple of months of 2019. And the two prevailing theories, which are by common terminology, are called lab leak and wet market. The lab leak theory posits that the virus emerged accidentally from a Chinese laboratory, most commonly said to be the Wuhan Institute of Virology, although one reporter has told me that the DOE report is fingering a different Wuhan lab on the other side of town, again, with low confidence. But most reports center on the Wuhan Institute of Virology. The other dominant theory is that the virus was transmitted from an animal or animals, quite possibly twice, in the Wuhan wet market. And the wet markets are markets where animals, live animals, are housed, stored, and sold to members of the public as foodstuffs. And one of the more compelling steers towards the wet market hypothesis is that something similar is generally accepted to be the cause of the 2002-2003 SARS-1 outbreak in a different wet market elsewhere in China. That's not considered controversial. And to the extent that it's proven, or at least there's a dominant array of evidence, that is the model on which the wet market COVID-19 pandemic origin is based. And it's one of the reasons why most scientific opinion favors it, because there's more hard evidence that you can actually assess. And one of the major problems we have, and will probably always have, is the absence of information. There is essentially no hard fact available to the public and to the scientific community that nails down the lab leak hypothesis. There is no single piece of evidence that says, yes, that must have happened. There is speculation. There are lines of thought, but there is no solid evidence. The strongest evidence for the wet market, again, is circumstantial, but it's more of it. And Mike Warraby, who's one of the major scientists involved in this, put out an excellent editorial in the LA Times last week, in which he summarized the evidence that was published in Science last year. And it's multi-pronged, but a lot of it is based on sample collection in the wet market after the pandemic was realized and before it was bleached into oblivion as a public health measure. So some samples were collected and could be analyzed and checked for signs of the COVID virus. And some of those samples came up positive. So there was virus in that market pretty early on. Now, does that prove that the virus came from animals in that market? No, you can't prove that because you don't have real-time sampling. All you can have is the presence of virus in a suspect area at the right place and at a plausible, relevant time. And there was also epidemiological tracking of what information is available from China about the early pandemic cases in Wuhan, or the early virus detection and symptomatic hospitalized cases. And there was a cluster around the Wuhan wet market that was, and again, this is an epidemiology argument, it's laid out in detail, but it was not consistent. It was consistent with there being two transmissions of virus from animals to humans at around the right time and place. And so when it comes to hard facts, that's about it. And any remaining hard facts will have been buried by the Chinese government a long time ago. It is not in the Chinese government's interests now to reveal any more than they've already revealed. And for whatever the origin was, whichever of the two hypotheses is correct, the Chinese government does not come out well. If it was a lab leak and they're not admitting to it, that's culpable and highly embarrassing. If it was a wet market origin, the Chinese have had since 2002 to reduce the transmission threat of viruses from wild animals to humans in the wet market environment, and they didn't do that. Well, it's not trivial to do that. It's a major industry in China. It's like us policing the American cattle industry. So, you know, there's no simple, quick solution the Chinese could have done, but it would have been, it still would have been embarrassing for it to have happened twice in 20 years to trigger a very serious pathogenic virus outbreak. So, you know, China is not an open society. The Chinese government suppresses facts on a routine and daily basis. They have culpability, whatever the origin truly was. And I don't see them changing their perspective on this. It is possible that in some time in the future, a defector with actual knowledge, as opposed, we've had defectors with speculative knowledge and some pretty wild stuff has gone on, but a defector with actual knowledge might one day spill the beans. It is possible that the American or European or world spy agencies might uncover something they probably don't have access to. But we don't know. And, you know, I mentioned that the DOE had apparently concluded with low confidence that the lab leak origin was favored. The FBI concluded last year with slightly higher, moderate confidence in favor of the lab leak. So that's two, but 5 other US agencies, including I think the National Intelligence Council, have concluded the opposite. So the score is 5-2 in federal government agencies or councils in favor of the wet market hypothesis, but none with high confidence. And that's a reflection of, again, the absence of hard facts, and it reflects the difference of opinion within the scientific community. I mean, 5-2 would probably not be an unreasonable split among knowledgeable virologists and people with, you know, reasonable degrees of expertise. It might be, you know, more like 90% to 10 in favor of wet market, but that's you know, a speculative opinion. So the concern is that we may never know. We may literally never know the true origin, and we'll be condemned to go round and round these arguments, which have become highly politicized. And that doesn't help a scientific discussion. It doesn't help the uncovering of the truth. And a lot of it's driven by Republican China hawks, which, you know, want to bash China because China is seen as a major economic and possibly military threat to the USA. And, you know, I'm not going to get into the geopolitics of it all, but there's no question that there's a wing of the Republican Party that will not listen to anything good about China and will emphasize anything bad. And the lab leak argument has certainly fallen on fertile ground among some of the congressional reps who were speaking last week. So, you know, that's how I see it. I wish I could tell you more that was deeply rooted in science and would help everyone understand in more detail what we've been living through, but I can't. That's the limit of my ability to summarize the basics. And I can take questions and we can have a wider chat, but I don't have any insights that haven't been shared in the media beyond what I've been telling you.
If you do have questions, and I'm sure you do, please put them in the Q&A box, and we'll read them. So in terms of a lab leak, no one is saying that this was, you know, something that was a diabolical plan. Because as you point out in your article, 1 million people in China have died. And no one is saying that it was an accident.
Well, no one's saying that now, although very early on, and it still crops up on the more, you know, QAnon type discussion fora, that the Chinese engineered SARS-CoV-2 as a bioweapon. I think that's not credible. It doesn't have the properties you would want in a bioweapon. I mean, look, I'm not an expert in germ warfare, for heaven's sake, but a virus that kills 1 million of your own people in the space of 3 months, as has happened this year, is not something you want to be throwing out there as a bioweapon. It just doesn't have the properties. There are a lot nastier viruses and bacteria around for a country that truly wants to do something as heinous as that. So I don't think anyone really credible in this debate thinks that it's a bioweapon and was therefore deliberately engineered. The argument about whether a virus with SARS-CoV-2-like properties existed in the Wuhan Institute of Virology or another laboratory in Wuhan, according to this rumor about the DOE report, is for animal model testing. I mean, for testing in humanized mice, for instance, and that would be part of a pathogen defense research program in the same way that, there have been flu virology projects in the past that have been done to try to understand the fundamental properties of potentially a very nasty virus. So there could have been legitimate reasons to work on a SARS-CoV-2-like virus in the WIV. And there's evidence that there was work on those viruses, on viruses with similar properties, particularly bat viruses. But did it leak? That's where the evidence is lacking.
So, you say the advantage of knowing is that it will help us plan for the next pandemic. Although lab leak, could happen, anytime, so I'm going to read a few people submitted questions. I'm going to first get to the ones that people submitted when they registered. In one government report, the authors were criticizing scientists for taking over 2 years to publish data. I found this laughable since the time it takes to publish our data, and my experience review is much longer than this, and depending on multitude of factors. How can we have a discussion with politicians when they don't understand and may not want to understand how scientific research works? And he also asked, please discuss the foreign cleavage.
Yeah, I can read the questions.
Oh, okay. So
well, I mean, the first one, yeah, politicians don't understand science and the scientific process unless there are very few of them that have medical or science backgrounds, but that's rare in Congress. And many of them don't care to find out. They think that you snap your fingers and something is suddenly uncovered. And there's a fair amount of suspicion in some quarters about science. So, I don't have any solution to how to break down the trust barrier between political leaders and the scientific community. You either trust scientists or you don't. And having worked as a professional scientist for God knows how long now, I don't care to think about it. It's, most scientists are fundamentally honest, decent human beings, just like most journalists are, but some are not. Just like most bankers are, but some are not. Just like most lawyers are, but some are not. So there are always rogue elements in any profession, but most scientists are fundamentally interested only in discovering the truth and disseminating the truth. And politicians, I don't think, always appreciate that, and very few of them understand the process of science, including how you prepare scientific papers for release nowadays on a medical server by bioarchives, medarchives, which is really something that took off during the pandemic. Information is disseminated so much more quickly now, and sometimes in not completely digested form, compared to the prolonged process of getting it through peer review and editing and the the journal publication process, which has actually slowed down on COVID papers during the pandemic because of the volume of them. So much information is first disseminated on preprint servers, and some of it's pretty dubious. Most of it isn't. The top groups tend not to put junk out on preprint servers because their reputation is affected. Mm-hmm. So yeah, 2 years to publish data. I mean, that would actually be quite a long time. I mean, the the incentive for scientists is to get their information out there as quickly as possible, but in a form that is reliable, because otherwise your reputation is damaged. I mean, you get a lot of flack from your, peer colleagues for putting out junk quickly. And it really, if you have a reputation for that, it makes life very difficult. So there is a correction mechanism that you do take your time, and you do try to make sure that what you put out there is accurate, even if it's not the final form. So I don't know about 2 years. Depends on the paper, depends on the subject matter. But the general point about the lack of an understanding between scientists and politicians is very real, I think.
Okay, and do you want to answer the question about the cleavage site?
Yeah, the furin cleavage site, well, it's in the spike protein, the S protein, and it's a site that is at the division between the S1 and S2 subunits. The spike protein mediates the fusion process of the virus to the cell, and it's triggered by the binding to ACE2. I don't want to get into too, ultra nerdy description of this, but most type 1 fusion proteins on viruses, and I've been working on the HIV-1 fusion mechanism for 30 years, has a furin cleavage site. Furin is a host cell protease, and the clipping of the furin cleavage site activates the fusion potential of a type 1 fusion protein. So it's important for efficient fusion. And it was when the first sequence of SARS-CoV-2 was released by a Chinese lab via in communications, I believe, with Eddie Holmes in Australia, it was seen that there was a furin cleavage site, and it's very recognizable. I mean, as I say, I engineered my first furin cleavage site in an HIV protein, not a virus, a protein, in 2000. I mean, 22 years ago, my lab was messing around for a good reason with the furin cleavage site on an HIV subunit protein vaccine candidate. So, you can recognize this very easily. It's a string of REKs and Rs, arginines and lysines. It's very easy to spot. And when it was spotted, it surprised a group of people whose names are often in the papers nowadays, who were not aware at the time that furin cleavage sites can be found in coronaviruses. They had not expected to see a furin cleavage site in a coronavirus. And that triggered some discussions that have been quite well memorialized through FOIA leaks, or not FOIA release and other sources of email exchanges, that there was speculation that the presence of a furin cleavage site was indicative of an engineered virus. Right. And so that is being done to death as a discussion point, because it was held by some of the discussants, which included Jeremy Farrar from the UK, Tony Fauci, Collins, and a number of scientists. It was thought at first to be a problematic indicator of an engineered virus. And then John Cohen, who's an old friend of mine and probably somebody that you all know, he's a terrific science writer. He put out a blog post at the end of last year, sometime last October, November, that he sent me, and I thought it was very interesting. He described a little reported meeting in which some real coronavirus specialists, and there aren't that many of them in the States, but some genuine coronavirus virologists got on a call and said, hey guys, we want you to realize that there are coronaviruses that do naturally have furin cleavage sites, and that the presence of a furin cleavage site is not necessarily a sinister sign of engineering. And I suspect, and I do not know, that there was an oh shit moment when the people on these calls, the scientists and the government officials, realized that they had been drawing the wrong conclusion through a lack of detailed knowledge of the entire repertoire of coronaviruses, animal coronaviruses. Many animals have coronaviruses, not just bats and raccoon dogs and, civets and pangolins. So, and I cited that in the Smerconish article because I thought it was a terrific insight that John Cohen had from one of the coronavirus virologists who had contacted John anonymously because apparently he and his colleagues were pissed off that they never got the credit for their insights. I mean, it was a petty academic squabble, and believe me, I've been involved in enough of those to see some possibility that was real. So, is the furin cleavage site the sign of an engineered virus? I think coronavirus virologists would say no. But it's been held to be one. So, it is part of the debate.
He's been on our show. So,
John, yeah, I'm not surprised. I mean, yeah, he's a veteran and great reporter.
Yeah, it was fun to have him on the show. So I want to, share one thing that someone said to me is that he said, well, of course it was engineered. He said, it's such a weird virus. I mean, it's a respiratory virus, but it's affecting people's hearts. It's affecting people's, there's COVID toes, which, people have, there's long COVID. And he said, you didn't hear this from other viruses.
Well, in every virus is going to be different in its pathology to some extent. And what have we got? Experience with 2 pathogenic human coronaviruses? Yes. There is the common cold coronaviruses. There are 3, 4 of them that do not kill most people, but can kill people who are in vulnerable health. I mean, they're not dangerous, but most people don't die of the, common cold coronavirus, HKU1 or H229E. I mean, they're not killers. There are so many really good reviews that are published nowadays, but one I read last week summarized ACE2, the role of ACE2 in the body and its distribution in multiple tissues. Now, that is not new. That is not, the knowledge of ACE2 and its role in coronavirus pathology is not new. But it was a very good review and had a tissue by tissue, organ by organ description of the problems that virus replication in that tissue could cause. And blood clotting, and again, I'm not a pathologist, I'm not a physician, but blood clotting was a major unexpected pathogenic consequence of SARS-CoV-2, which wasn't seen at all or to the same extent in the SARS-CoV-1 outbreak in 2002. So the protein distribution of ACE2 seems to have a lot to do with the wide constellation of symptoms that can happen to people who get most severe COVID.
So the question I have is, why do people think it's a lab leak? What is the narrative that lab leak says to them?
What's the narrative? Well,
I mean, I understand Republicans want to, show us.
Well, I mean, to some extent, if you lock yourself into a position early on, it's sometimes hard to change your mind, especially in the absence of evidence. I mean, we're all opinionated, and scientists are no less opinionated than others, and same with politicians. But it's again the absence of evidence. I mean, I would take a definitive position on one or other of these hypotheses if I had definitive data that I could analyze and interpret as a scientist and discuss with colleagues that would make me say, yes, that's definitely what happened. As it is, as I say, I think the balance of evidence points me towards the wet market origin, but with, moderate confidence. Low confidence, by the way. I heard a talking head on one of the news shows say, well, I can predict with low confidence that you will win the lottery next week. It doesn't kind of mean much. It's sort of one up from neutral, but several ranks down from saying we know this happened.
So here's a question. I read recently that there have been approximately 700 million COVID infections in the world, and that 200 million of them have been in the United States.
Yeah.
If you believe the 700 million number is accurate, and whether or not it is, U.S. has had a disproportionate number of COVID infections. And she asks, how do our most prominent scientists explain this? And should this be an area of research?
Why have there been 200 million infections in the US? Is that the question?
Yes.
I mean, I think I haven't looked up the numbers for the last month or two, but I mean, it sounds about right. Well, if there had been 500 million, that'd be a problem because there's only 350 million of us. So you're never going to get everyone infected, and vaccination has protected a lot of people from ever being infected. 200 million might be an undercount. It's hard to know. Some blood donor surveys have kept estimates in excess of 90% for the total penetration of virus into the American blood donor population. But of course, that does not include children and some older adults. So we're urbanized. We did not do a very good job at stopping the initial waves of infection due to political mismanagement, largely. Britain, I have read a number of books about Britain during the pandemic, was even worse because the government was even more unwilling to take necessary public health measures early enough. I mean, if you're going to do a shutdown, the earlier you do it, the more effective it is. And if you have politicians dithering about it, then you lose a lot of the benefit. But Europe didn't exactly escape scot-free from a high level of infections. South America was decimated in the late 2000s. A lot of countries in South America had death rates that were certainly comparable to and possibly higher than the States. I mean, it's been a global pandemic. So I don't think there's anything unique about America. It's certainly got more cases per capita or more deaths per capita than most industrialized countries, which, again, reflects poor mismanagement at the national level.
Can you read the first question and just...
I can only read 3 questions. And the first one, we've been through the first 2. The third one says, how might China be held accountable?
No, it's in the Q&A box.
Oh, I don't know where that is. I'm sorry. Okay, I've got it now. Yeah.
So he's talking about the paper in Science.
Well, the Warraby Picard papers, what paper can be perfect? You can only analyze what samples you've got. I'm sure that the authors of that paper would want to have many other samples, but they're not available. So, that means the paper, well, it's not, that paper is not definitive proof. It's a clue towards in favor of one of the 2 hypotheses. And it's taken seriously by most scientists that I speak to, but they would have loved to have had more samples. But if the Chinese government doesn't make the samples available or never collected the samples, what can you do? How many other labs in China studying coronavirus? I read one media report that says there are 6 in Beijing alone. Most academic medical centers have virology labs, and many virology labs in the States would have, well, now, but perhaps not before the pandemic, would have had somebody who worked on coronaviruses. So, I don't know the answer to that, but as I said, one of the stories about the DOE report is they changed their mind because they are suspecting another lab in Wuhan. So, coronavirus labs are around, but if you're working on a, animal coronavirus, you may not be really in the same threat level as working on a human pathogenic virus.
So, and also in this article, you talk about Dr. Fauci, and that soon after the SARS-CoV genetic sequence was first released by a Chinese scientist, I'm sure on his own, and you do discuss the spike protein didn't look natural, but as anyone who's seen a congressional hearings, Dr. Fauci gets hammered about his cooperation with China, which I don't,
Well, I think I referred in that editorial to Fauci derangement syndrome. I mean, in the lights of, in the eyes of some people on the right, Tony Fauci can do nothing right, and everything is at his feet to blame. He's blamed for anything and everything, and I just can't take that seriously. I mean, he's not a personal friend. He's at a level of seniority that isn't mine. He's 15 years, 20 years older than I am, so we don't hang out in bars at conferences, which is not Tony's scene anyway. But all my interactions with him is he's been a straight shooter. So, I just look at some of that stuff and go, oh, it's just smear tactics.
So there's 2 other questions out there.
Yeah, I mean, well, anonymous attendee says, yeah, I've read this, I don't know, if I was going to put a furin cleavage site in a virus, I would do exactly what we did in 2000 with the protein subunit. We just went in with RRR, hexaarginine motif, because it's cleaved incredibly efficiently, and you want efficient cleavage. It wasn't rocket science to us 22 years ago. Mm-hmm. And I don't see it as rocket science now. If you wanted to engineer a cleavage site in a virus, you would do it much more easily than any of these different, hypotheses. I can't judge whether any of this speculation is correct or not. 5 of them are shared with other bat viruses. I mean, the bat is considered most likely to be the original source of SARS-CoV-2. But did it pass through another animal on the way to humans? And if so, what? And that's another unknown. And who knows what evolution might have taken place in this hypothetical unknown animal. Again, it's the absence of data that drives us all nuts here. We just can't get these answers. So you get these speculations about, somewhat, in some cases, arcane aspects of a site that is not unique to SARS-CoV-2, but is not widely found in coronaviruses, but is present in some coronaviruses. So what can you say? It's not an answerable question with any definitive way. At least I can't answer it in any definitive way.
Has China made any moves towards closing wet markets?
Not to my knowledge, but I'm not a China expert. I mean, no. I don't follow the political developments of the Chinese government on a daily basis, but I don't know is the simple answer to that.
Should they?
Well, I did say that earlier on that it's not a trivial matter because it's a huge industry and it's a major cultural tradition. But if they don't, they're running the risk of something bad happening again in the future. And it may not be a coronavirus next time.
No.
But how do you make a country change its national policies? I mean, shouting at them tends not to work very well.
We had a climate scientist on the show who talked about how that in the future, pandemics will be more likely because animals are being, taken out of their natural habitats and interacting, more in civilization, with people and these things. They're not just confined to where they naturally were.
Well, there's more. It's a legitimate argument, but as we concrete over more and more places where animals live, there'll be less and less animals to meet. I don't know. That's a question not really for a lab scientist.
Okay. So another question.
Okay, about the India question.
Yes.
Well, I mean, the Indian government statistics are, to use a technical term, bullshit. I mean, there have been surveys done and published in the scientific journals about the undercounting of the pandemic in India by, in some estimates, a factor of 10 or more. So whatever the reported statistics for Indian deaths, it is nowhere near what truly happened. And I play cricket as my weekend warrior sport, and my cricket club is heavily India dominated. Most of the players, not all of them, most of the players are Indian heritage. And, you know, we had a lot of insights at the time, what was going on in the Delta wave in 2021 in India, because many of them had sick and dying relatives and were desperately seeking whatever help they could get, particularly as they weren't allowed to travel. I mean, that's an anecdote. I'm not presenting that as a science fact, but it was well understood that the Modi administration was burying the buried. It was not admitting what was going on. And, you know, in rural India, there's not a lot of collection of healthcare statistics, and bodies were going on funeral pyres without necessarily being recorded. But no, India had a devastating wave in 2021, early 2021, before the Delta wave hit the States. And it was pre-vaccination. And a lot of the Indian vaccines, well, Indian vaccines are okay. They use the AstraZeneca vaccine a lot. The inactivated Indian vaccine is no worse than the Chinese vaccines, but it's mediocre by the standards of the mRNAs.
Mm-hmm. Well, talking about vaccines, since that's one of the things we've talked about many, many times. What's our future with that? You know, will we be getting an annual COVID vaccine with a flu shot?
Well, FDA is going to make, and CDC are going to make recommendations later this summer. I mean, there's been announcements that we're pointing towards an annual booster being made available for those who want it, without any sort of hint of a mandate or even necessarily recommendations for healthy under 50s. So, you know, it's gone a bit quiet. There may be a composition change. I personally would not bother changing the composition. I mean, I put an editorial in MedPage today with Celine Gounder about a month ago, in which we said that we would make the next vaccine composition monovalent for sure, because diluting it 50-50 with the original Wuhan ancestral strain just now makes no sense at all. So we would make it ancestral. We would make it ancestral out, monovalent only. And given the, you know, immune imprinting or the sort of, you know, old term original antigenic sin, it really won't make much difference if we kept with BA.4/5 instead of switching to, say, XBB.1, which was the last one that was kind of trending. It just wouldn't make a great deal of difference, not to immunologically experienced people. And do you want to spend a great deal of money and time and effort making a new stock of vaccine when its benefit would be only marginal? That's what we were saying, and it's not a zero-sum game. It costs time and trouble to adjust the composition of a vaccine. So we would go with monovalent BA.4/5. And I don't think anyone should be getting a booster unless you're in very, you know, vulnerable section of society. Getting a booster around 5 or 6 months makes some kind of sense. Doing it at 3 and 4 months kind of doesn't. So and at the moment we're in quite a, you know, relatively good lull. I mean, I was thinking in November, December of last year that we would still see a very high level Omicron virus attack rate this winter, and it didn't happen. I was pleased I was not right about that. It's been a, yeah, okay, there's underreporting, people don't report home tests, etc., etc. I mean, I'm not pretending that COVID has completely gone away, but I don't think it's been as high a caseload in the last couple of months as I thought we would see.
Well, I know people, like you said, as you said, some people want 100 shots, some people want none. And I know people were saying, well, I got my booster in September, you know, it's been 6 months, it's probably worn off.
Well, we've talked about this before. I mean, there are people who will never get a shot ever because they feel the vaccines are Satan's spawn. And there are people who feel that a dose a day keeps the doctor away. I mean, there are, you know, and in between, there's the middle ground of common sense. You get an annual booster. Well, again, you know, what's the state of the pandemic going to be next November? is there still going to be significant amounts of circulating virus? We don't know, but if essentially the pandemic does fade away over the summer, it may not be necessary to get another booster in October, November. I'm not predicting that, I'm not saying that, but you would base decisions on the available data at the time you need to make a decision. But I'm sure there is going to be another manufacture effort. I mean, I think the FDA will switch to XBB1. I don't think it should, as I said, but I think it will. And there will be another push this winter, this next winter rather.
And also, I've been asked to ask you about the, I think, the heart-related ailments with the latest bivalent vaccines.
The what? Sorry,
The heart-related ailments.
There's been no difference in the performance of the bivalent vaccine compared to the original. There's just been a huge amount of disinformation, and this absurd movie Died Suddenly, which is the equivalent of 2,000 mules if you are in the Stop the Steal J6 crowd. To professional scientists, Died Suddenly is just a work of fiction, but it's designed to rile up the anti-vaccine movement and scare people. And I mentioned, my colleague and friend Celine Gounder. Last December, her husband died of an aortic aneurysm while covering the World Cup. Died suddenly, and she was instantly abused. And some of the abuse she got was just disgusting. I've seen the emails. I've listened to the voicemails. Accusing, saying that her husband was killed by the vaccines, and why wouldn't she admit it, and why is she covering us all up? It was just horrific. I mean, these people are absolute disgraces to humanity, the things that they will do. And one of the few kicks I get has been answering, taking some of Celine's emails and writing back to some of the trolls and trolling them, because it makes me feel better.
It's good. I mean, I just got an email today about the doctor saying, "Oh, I'm seeing all these people who died suddenly," and then there's a link to the Died Suddenly video.
Yeah, I mean, sure. And if it's a doctor saying that, he or she should be struck off. No. I mean, the facts of the matter are there are cardiac complications from COVID that are very serious for severe COVID cases, and vaccination prevents those cardiac complications, myocarditis. So the benefit is strongly in favor of vaccination, because although there are some myocarditis cases in young males, particularly, even then at a very low rate. I mean, it is not, an epidemic of myocarditis in young males, but the risk-benefit equation for vaccination is strongly in favor of vaccination, because COVID can really screw up your circulatory system and your heart.
Yeah, one of my doctors said he's had his blood pressure has been higher since he got COVID.
Yeah, I mean, it's a long COVID symptom. Yeah. It's a disruption of multiple organs, not necessarily multiple organs in every body, but there are multiple organs that are disrupted in some people. But this is just another of the things we have to live with in America today, where disinformation and outright lies are the currency believed by about 40% of Americans, because they get their information from Fox News. I mean, we're seeing Tucker Carlson and Hannity and Ingraham exposed for their lies over Stop the Steal and pre-January the 6th. And around, 5 people died on January the 6th? Well, the same people spreading vaccine disinformation on Fox News have contributed to the deaths of 300,000 or 400,000 people who believe this garbage. And they've not been called out yet for their vaccine disinformation, but one day there might be a lawsuit that takes these guys to court in the same way that Dominion did.
So I've had to go to doctors, like everybody else, and I've noticed even doctors aren't wearing masks anymore.
Yeah.
Is this a surprise to you? You think it's okay?
I don't want to tell doctors what to do. There are some, I'm on our general faculty council, and there are some physicians that want to have the intra-building hospital mask mandate reduced or eliminated. Others don't. It's a divided opinion. At the moment, I'm physically sitting in a medical school inside a hospital. If I go outside my office, I am required to wear a mask, which is no big deal, and I do, and I take it off when I go out the doors. So it's still a rule, and most physicians think that's the right thing to do, but there are some who don't, and it might be appropriate at some stage in the future to revisit this and you know, have an educated, sensible discussion without getting inflamed and politicized.
Okay, so I'm going to give you a final word, and then, well, wait, before that. So next week, I'm interviewing Dan Levitt, who wrote this book. It's called The Story of Your Body's Atoms from the Big Bang Through Last Night's Dinner. Here's the book, and that'll be next Wednesday. So any final words, Dr. Moore?
Well, as I say, I wish we had answers to questions that we would all wish to know the answer to, but we don't. And I wish the politicians would just shut up about the politicization of the pandemic origin question, because it doesn't help. I mean, shouting at China isn't going to persuade them to be more transparent. That's not going to happen. So I just see it as very unhelpful. I think the demonization of some of the scientists who have offered opinions on the pandemic origin has not been helpful. Hauling them in front of Congress isn't going to reveal new information. It's going to be another media spectacle. I don't think it will lead to an answer. So, you know, we could probably have the same conversation in a year's time based on the absence of new facts.
Is there any chance that a real legitimate scientist from China who might defect would actually tell us?
I can't answer that question. It must be a non-zero possibility.
Okay.
Someone who knows something will eventually one day defect.
Yeah.
But, you know, they would have to hide particularly hard, because I'm sure their life would be put in danger if they did do that.
Definitely is. Anyways, once again, thank you. It's always great having you as a guest. And we appreciate it. If you're on Saturday Night Live, we'll be giving you the 5-time coat that people have gotten who are 5-time hosts of Saturday Night Live. So maybe we'll do that at some point. Anyway, stay safe out there, and thank you, and we'll see you next March 22nd.
Yep, good night.
Good night.